Hello, everyone. Welcome to Canteen Cup. And first off, a happy new year to everybody. I hope if you haven't made your New Year's resolutions yet, that you'll do so before today is out. That's my plan. I didn't make any last night because I really wanted to take some time this year and do some good playing. We've done a lot the past year, and we've got a lot to do next year. So it's not a off the top of your head list. So we're going to take some time today and work on that. However, today, what I wanted to talk to you about are amateur radios or radios in general and using them with a battery. A lot of times we talk about when the power goes down, when the grid goes down, and you still have to communicate, you have to use a battery because that's all you have. Now, you can use a battery, you can use your car battery that's in your car. However, you have to be careful because if you run your battery down too much, you can't start your car. So really, in general terms, it's probably best to have a separate battery. And we'll talk about getting them going in another video. However, today, I wanted to talk about the battery capacity and your radio, and how there's some things you need to be aware of. And the example battery today is what they call a 100 amp hour battery. I'm using 100 amp hours, not that that's a specific battery, but there may be some out there. But with 100, I can divide and multiply pretty easy in my head, so I don't need to do a lot of complicated math. So first thing we need to discuss is what is an amp hour. An amp hour is basically it's the consumption of 1 amp over a period of an hour. And what that means is if you have a 100 amp hour battery, if you put a load on that battery that draws 1 amp, that battery will last 100 hours before going dead. Okay, I'm going to say that again. If you have a 100 amp hour battery and you put a load on it, we'll say a little radio, and it draws 1 amp, that your battery will last 100 hours. So that's what an amp hour is. Now, is that really a truthful capacity when you talk about your radios? The answer is no, or probably not. And here's why. Modern radios require X amount of voltage to operate. And once the voltage drops below a certain amount, the radios, either they work the degraded capacity, less power out, or they just stop working altogether. And in today's radios, that's a pretty narrow band. A lot of radios will not operate below 11 volts. Now, a car battery is like 12.6. So you've got from 12.6 to about 11 volts. And then 11 volts below, the radio probably will not work. So let's go back to our amp hours and batteries. You have a battery that has 100 amp hours. So what that means is when the battery is fully charged at 12.6 volts, it has 100 amp hours. When the battery drops to 0 amp hours, in other words, what they consider a dead battery, that's about 10.5 volts. And remember, I said that your radio typically needs somewhere around 11 volts to operate. So translating that, it means that if you're using your battery for radios, that you cannot use that full capacity. You can't use that full 100 amp hours, because as the electricity is being taken from the battery, the voltage is also dropping. And so there's a point when it'll hit 11 volts on its way down to 10.5. And when about that 11 volts is when a lot of modern HF radios will stop working. So when you are looking at the capacity of your battery and your intended use, you have to consider, the first thing you have to consider is that you cannot use that full capacity of that battery for your radios. Now you can use it for other things, but as far as your radio, you can't use the full thing. And a good rule of thumb is about 50%. So now, when you're talking about using a car battery for radios, if it's rated at 100 amp hours, well, now it's down to 50 amp hours. Okay, so let's talk about calculating your capacity and using your radio with this particular battery. You have 50 amp hours to start with. So typically, an HF radio that's pushing 100 watts of RF power uses about 18 amps of battery power to drive it. So let's round, just for the sake of argument, let's round that up to 20 amps to make the math a little easier. And so if you did nothing but talk on your radio until the battery used up its 50 amp hours, and you're pulling 20 amp hours every time you talk, you can operate that radio, for about 2.5 hours. Okay? That's because in 2.5 hours, if you're doing nothing but transmitting, your radio will consume 50 amp hours of your battery. But you don't always talk on the radio. You spend a lot of time listening. And again, most modern radios today, when they are sitting idle on receive with the volume turned up, where you hear stag in the background, they're drawing somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 amps or 1 to 2 amp hours. So when you're calculating how to use your battery, or how much battery you have to use, you have to consider that you don't talk all the time and you don't listen all the time. You kind of do both. And so you may, just to make this easy, in that 5 hours, or those 50 amp hours you have, you may talk for 1 hour, and you may listen for, we'll say 15. Okay, so talking for 1 hour, that's 20 amps. And then you're listening at, we'll say 15 minutes, or actually we'll just say 1 hour, just so I can keep the math in my head going. If you talk for an hour, that's 20 amp hours. If you listen for 1 hour, that's 1 amp hour. That's 21 amp hours that you've used. So you could talk for another hour and listen for another hour, and you'd still have battery left over. So that's how you have to kind of calculate this. You calculate how many amp hours you're going to talk, or how many hours you're going to talk for a given amount of time, and you multiply that by the draw of your radio. In other words, if you talk for 2 hours, if you transmit for 2 hours at 20 amp hours, that's 40 amp hours, which means if you have 50 amp hour capacity, you have 10 amp hours left. And so if you listen the rest of the time at 1 amp hour, you have 10 hours you can listen. Now, why is this important? Because when we have mains power, in other words, when we're hooked up to the grid, you can listen and talk all you want. But once that goes away, or if that goes away, you now have a limited amount of power available for your radios unless you have a means to resupply that. So you may not be able to leave your radio on all the time. So you may have to develop a communications plan where you turn your radio on twice a day. We'll say between 7 and 8 in the morning and between 5 and 6 in the afternoon for 1 hour. And you listen, and you may or may not talk, but you calculate, then you can calculate how many days you can actually use your radio based on using it X amount of time. And when we talk about emergency communications, we tend to use the Pareto rule of the 80-20 rule, where you should be listening about 80% of the time and talking maybe 20% of the time. And so when you're on batteries, conserve your power and talk only as little as possible. Say it quick, say it often, then go back to listening because you extend your life. So that's just a quick talk about batteries and how you can determine your capacity. I may go back and edit some of that stuff out, but really, if you go by the rule, if you look at your battery, on the top of your battery, it'll say what your amp hours is. Don't go by the cranking amps, because that's not the same. You want the amp hour rating of that battery. And for most car batteries, it's around between 55 and 75. Take that number, divide it by 2, and that's about how much capacity your battery is for using radios. And then you need to determine again what your amp draw is, and for HF radio, it's about 18 amps to transmit on 100 watts. It's about 10 amps at 50 watts, and so you can adjust that. You may to talk longer on your batteries, you may reduce the power of your radio, and then to listen, it's about 1 amp to 2 amps in general. You'd have to measure your specific radio to figure that out, but for calculating purposes, figure 1 amp to 2 amps, and then that'll tell you how long you can listen and how long you can talk on your battery. I hope this helps. It's something that people don't talk about a whole lot, but I want to get that out there for those that are just getting into this and are just trying to figure out how to run their radios when you don't have mains power. So we'll have more about this in the future. So everybody, stay safe. Stay secure. Happy New Year.